Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the coffee break with Sky Island Alliance. Thanks for joining us this morning. We're excited to see that so many people are interested in learning about the amazing animals that live really throughout the Sky Island region, but especially here right in the heart of the Sky Islands along the border. I'm Emily Burns. I'm the program director with Sky Island Alliance, and we started this project, gosh, it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And if you're like me, that feels like it was at least 10 or 15 years ago, but it was only 4.5 years ago. But so much has happened around the world, I'm sure for all of us personally, and certainly along the border. We're really excited to share with you what we've been learning by analyzing the photos that are capturing the amazing events of wildlife on the move in the borderlands. And really every single day at Sky Island Alliance, we learn a little bit more about this story unfolding, about what's happening with border policy on the ground, the effects of climate change on this landscape that we love so much, and then insight into the lives of these incredible species. The place that we're going to talk about today down at the U.S. Mexico border is a place that's near and dear to our heart. We love going down there to do field work, and we're really following in the footsteps of so many people that have used this region as a continental crossroads. It's really been a place where people have intermixed on the landscape for many millennia. It's a place where subtropical and temperate species intermix. And we want to acknowledge that our cameras are rolling on the ancestral lands of indigenous peoples, including the Pascua Yaqui and the Tohono O'odham and others. Today, these lands are managed by public agencies, and we appreciate the access that they've provided for us to have these cameras running for so many years. And we're not done. There's so much more to do. We have expanded our border wildlife studies so much, we cannot squeeze it all into one webinar. So this is going to be the first in a series that will be coming out over the next couple of months, talking about our work along the border. And with that, I would like to just express from the bottom of my heart complete appreciation for our wildlife team at Sky Island Alliance. Megan Bethel is going to speak first. She's our wildlife specialist, followed by Eamon Hardy. He's our wildlife program manager. And together, they have just created such an amazing project. And I hope you're as inspired by the data that they show and the photos they show today as I am. If you have comments or questions during the webinar, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be keeping track of those, and we'll make sure that we save time for question and answers with Eamon and Megan at the end. So with that, again, welcome, and I'm going to pass it off to Megan. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Emily, for that lovely introduction. And welcome, everyone. And I'm here to introduce the border wildlife study again. And as Emily alluded to, we can't have this project without the generous support from our supporters, and as well as many individual gifts. I know many of you are here today. In addition to our land managers who allow the cameras on their land, and our collaborators, and a huge host of volunteers. We can't get this work done without a network of volunteers, interns, and staff. And here's some fun pictures from the field throughout the years and across the landscape. Thank you, everyone. So just a little overview of the Sky Island region. This is a map of the Sky Islands, and it's situated in southern Arizona, southern New Mexico, and Sonora. And it's it's a melting pot of so many different ecotypes and ecosystems. The Sonora Desert, you have the Chihuahuan Desert and the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, and the Sierra Madre. And it's just a melting pot of vegetation, animals, as well as the people here too. And unfortunately, bisecting this amazing region is a little black line on that map, which is the U.S. Mexico border. And it's not so little on the landscape. This is a section in the Huachuca Mountains. But if you go to the next slide, that line could be up to 30 feet tall, and it's impermeable to most animals. And that's a reality we have to live with on this landscape. However, if on this land, there is still some unwalled gaps. And these are the last gaps in the Sky Island region that have not been walled off with that 30-foot or 15-foot steel barrier. And this is the border right here, and that's called vehicle barrier fencing, as well as some barbed wire fencing. And if you go to the next slide, we have a video of why this type of structure is so important, because it's still permeable to large animals like this big black bear going south into Mexico. It squeezes under the vehicle barrier and it goes through some barbed wire and it's home clear. And the region we're talking about today is some of these last gaps that are still open to these animals and allow them to be in their natural range and fulfill their natural lifestyle. So just an overview of what we're going to talk about today. There's some pictures that not there they are that showed up. We have cameras across sections of the border in the Sky Islands. If you see those little green dot or kind of green shapes on the map, those are the mountain ranges of the Sky Island region. And today we're mostly going to be talking about the San Rafael Valley, but we also have cameras in the San Pedro River Valley in the center there, as well as in the San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge off to the right there. And they have different sections of wall. We're looking at the vehicle barrier, the 15-foot, and then the large 30-foot wall. And as Emily mentioned, we don't have enough time to talk about every single finding and discovery. So please stay tuned for future talks about these two other locations, the San Pedro River and the San Bernardino Valley. They're both fascinating and very different ecosystems to what our current, our 4-year border wildlife studies been looking at. So here's some little preview, but today we're going to focus on our core border wildlife study that's in the San Rafael Valley that has that only the vehicle barrier on the border wall. That's been ongoing since 2020, and it's one of the last unwalled sections of the Sky Islands, which is why it's just so important, because we don't know the future of it really. So to date, in October 2024, we've had over 7 million photos taken by our cameras. However, only 138,000 are actually true positive pictures. These cameras are set in grasslands, so it's literally taking pictures of grass growing. But it's super special to even have that many true positive detections of animals or creatures in the landscape. And so far, we've had 139 unique species detected on our cameras. And here's just a little preview. We've had a wide array of species, from birds like the kestrel or quail, all the way down to the large charismatic mammals like javelina bear, and as well as our coyote and deer, which I always say are our most charismatic photo takers. A lot of our pictures today will be of the coyotes. But looking at all those photos, the most common species detected across these cameras are the white-tailed deer. And that's pretty typical. They're a very common deer species in the Sky Island region. They tend to be more up in the mountains where our cameras are. And however, this year, they surpassed the number of cattle detections. Usually in the past, it's cows are always the most frequent, just because they're always in herds. But this year, it was very fascinating and great to see that white-tailed deer are the most common. The most common mesocarnivore. A mesocarnivore are those small, medium-sized carnivores, like foxes, bobcats, even some skunks. They're not the big ones. But the gray fox was the most common. Here you can see a fun photo of a gray fox leaping around. I think there was a den nearby this camera, and there's lots of great fox photos on from this camera. And one little interesting tidbit is the skunk. That's also a mesocarnivore, but in the Sky Islands, we have 4 unique skunk species. And it's always fascinating to keep track about what is actually the most common species in the Sky Islands. It's the hooded skunk. They're a subtropical species, so they're only a little bit going into the U.S. and Arizona and Texas. So the fact that a skunk with such a small range in the U.S. itself is the most common is pretty fascinating to see that, like versus a striped skunk, just found much more common across the U.S. And then birds, we're not really focusing on bird species in the study because the wildlife cameras are more targeted to large mammals, but the Mexican jay continues to be our most common bird species. And if you've ever hiked in the Scott Islands, you'll know they're such a quintessential part of this region. Right. And so next, I'm just going to do some fun kind of storytelling showing our year from 2024, some fun wildlife photos we've seen. And I'll walk you kind of through a timeline. So it's still really stinking hot here in where I am in Tucson, but let's throw back to, this is February of 2024, where we had snow, and we had a couple interesting detections of coati, white-nosed coati, in a snowstorm. There's this one. If you go to the next photo, here's another daytime picture of a coati in snow. And besides being really great pictures, the coatis are another subtropical species, ranging into Central and a little bit of South America. And just the fact to see a tropical, subtropical animal in the snow is just very interesting to see. Excuse me. And the fact that they're adapting and surviving and thriving in this region, regardless of the temperatures, is really special that we can detect that on our cameras. Next, please. Another great snow picture. It's a dream about a white Christmas or whatever. But here's a mule deer, nice buck, walking through. This is the San Rafael Valley. And then this is our other most common deer species, the white-tailed deer. If any of our volunteers, interns who've worked on our cameras know, you have to learn how to identify deer species from their headshots or their antlers. This is a beautiful example of a male white-tailed deer antler set. I can always talk about that more at a later date. And of course, the bobcat, your Arizona Wildcats, if you're a fan, but it's always lovely to see this bobcat. I did a blog post earlier this year about a bobcat family on this camera. And this might be one of the juveniles from that mother I featured in that blog. And this is going to March, kind of the rugged, dry time of the year. And this is just actually a cow knocked this camera a little bit, but this photo of a coyote is just so striking as it moves through a probably windy day on the landscape. And here's another coyote photo. Since our cameras are out 24/7 for 4 years now, we've really seen the landscape change. And this is a photo after a prescribed burn in the Huachuca Mountains. So the Forest Service prescribed it and they managed it very well. And this is the first animal that was back. I think it was like 5 days after the fire went through. And the coyotes are so tough, they just keep on going. And this isn't a wildlife picture, but this is a kind of fun progression. This is that same prescribed burn. If you go to the next picture, Eamon, it went right through our camera. We try to remove our cameras if we know there's a prescribed burn in the area, but something, we didn't grab this one in time or something didn't get communicated. And luckily our camera survived, but it's a really cool progression of wildfire and the burns on the landscape. Here's another really kind of cool picture. I don't know if you can tell, but there's a little blurry shape off to the right, and that's a porcupine. We've been detecting porcupine in much higher numbers than we ever thought in the San Rafael Valley in this region. And we knew they were in the landscape, in the grassland landscape. I've been looking at some research about that. But this is the first photo of one actually traveling across the grasslands. We mostly see them in the cottonwood galleries, kind of in the distance behind, but this is showing that he's moving around, and it's kind of very fun. It's like a unicorn almost. Like, what? It's a porcupine. And some other fascinating species is these are a pronghorn, and this herd was reintroduced after being extirpated. And this is a breeding herd, and it's this little juvenile coming up to the camera. I don't have the photo in this slideshow, but it comes and like basically licks the camera after this. But just to see these seasonal patterns of movement and breeding and birth and life in this landscape is just invaluable. Here's the other side of from birth. Everyone's got to eat. I think this is probably, I don't know what it's in his mouth, maybe a deer, but a very wet, soggy coyote. But luckily he has something to eat. But I always love the coyote pictures on these cameras. They're always up to something. Hope he gets warm. And speaking of coyotes always grabbing something, this one was pretty funny. We couldn't figure out what was in its mouth for a while until the volunteer who checked this camera said like a strap was missing. And we were like, basically like a crime scene, went back in time and saw the coyote had stolen the strap. Who knows where it taken it, but it's always kind of fun to go back through and see what happens. Oh, here's just another nice picture. A lot of my favorite photos are from the San Rafael grassland, just because you get the really interesting like pronghorn species in that wild open landscape. This is a nice female. And then, of course, the charismatic black bear. This is a young, I think, black bear. It's brown, but the black bears can be any color, brown and kind of blondish color. But this is a nice one of it trucking along. This is in the Huachuca Mountains, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that overview, Megan. We have so many wonderful photos from these cameras, and Megan really isn't essential to effectively getting through them and turning these photos into data that we can use to tell stories and understand a little bit about the community of species we're seeing at the border. And so for the next series of slides, we're going to transition away from all these amazing photos and work with some more maps and a few figures. I promise we'll work in some fun photos as well. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of the results, some of the data we've seen from these photos. And as we go, just to orient again, our cameras are distributed across the U.S. Mexico border, starting on the Patagonia Mountains here on the west or left side of your screen.
Hey, Eamon, can I interrupt you for a second? It sounds like you have an echo going on in your recording.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Just continue on. I don't think it's too distracting.
Okay, well, hopefully it gets better, and if not, technology, it's always getting in the way. To continue on, each one of these black points is a camera location that's remained largely fixed or in the same place for the duration of this study. The cameras are clustered into groups of 8 to 10, and that's just to effectively sample this whole area without requiring hundreds and hundreds of cameras, because it is a fairly large area, about 30 miles wide from east to west. And so for the next few slides, I'll show different representations of information, either using the camera locations themselves to show things that are happening at those camera locations. We'll also work with some graphs. I'll explain the axes as they come up. But one of the first things we can look at is just let me see if I can change the slides. Oh gosh, sorry. Okay, I will keep going. We jumped ahead a little bit. So what I wanted to show is if we represent or if we look into the distribution of skunk species at each of these camera locations. So the locations themselves got moved around a little bit for display purposes because the pie charts are larger than the points themselves. But if we consider these fantastic 4 species of skunks, and we look in the western Patagonias on the left side of the screen, we see the camera locations are really dominated by hooded skunks. The most prevalent species is the hooded skunk on the western Patagonias. As we enter into the eastern Patagonias, we see that diversity of species really increasing. In fact, many of the cameras have what we call skunk bingo, or all 4 species. As we transition down into the lowlands again of the valley and into the foothills of the Huachuca Mountains on the east or right side of your screen, really just kind of dominated by hooded skunks. They really are our most common skunk species around. But as we increase in elevation and as we climb into the Huachuca Mountains on the east side of the screen, we see a fun story take place where the hooded skunks are replaced in a way by hognose skunk. They're really the more dominant species in the Huachuca Mountains. This is biologically interesting to understand how species are changing in space. It's also relevant to management and science as we look to understand the distribution of species in our region. Another type of pattern we can look at rather than a spatial pattern is a temporal pattern, where again, returning to these pronghorn species, which were extirpated and reintroduced to the San Rafael Valley. This graph is showing just monthly detections on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. And we see a really strong and striking seasonal pattern where every March, these animals show up in our study area. They stick around through August, maybe September. Relatively low numbers at first, but it's a very repeated pattern. What this is actually showing is that these animals are using our study area for calving. Every year they come in, they have young, and then during the winter or off season for breeding, they disappear, likely heading back further north. One more pattern that jumps out on this map is, of course, that 23 was a really big year, much bigger, much higher numbers than any previous year. And while we're still tallying 2024, it does look like 2023 was much bigger than this current year as well. What was interesting in particular about 2024 versus 23 was the spatial arrangement of these animals. Typically, this map is showing where we see these animals in 23, but the pattern is the same for 2020, 21, 22, etc. These animals occur in the San Rafael Valley, State Natural Protected Area, which is shown in white on this map here. But the story is largely that these animals occur here and nowhere else within our study area. However, in 2024, we had two exciting observations. The first was this series of photos, and actually lasted longer than a day, but the pronghorn are using the landscape much further east for the first time in our 4.5-year study. They're using this kind of foothill of the Huachuca Mountains. And this is a photo from a camera near there. Another really exciting and perhaps even more exciting observation was this star is indicating that we've seen pronghorn in Sonora, Mexico. And this is the first observation of pronghorn on the south side of the U.S. Mexico border here in many, many years. Pronghorn are restricted or struggle to navigate barbed wire fences. So even though this valley is relatively open in terms of border infrastructure, it's long been inferred that the vehicle barrier and that barbed wire fence was slowing or impeding the pronghorn from moving into Mexico. But a related camera that's part of a different study of ours documented and recorded this pair of pronghorn using the landscape in Mexico, which was quite exciting to see as, like I said, the first in many, many years that pronghorn had been seen in Sonora. Another species with a very striking and regular seasonal pattern is, of course, the American black bear. These animals appear every year in April as they exit hibernation, and they occur on our cameras until about November. The Sky Islands are the southern terminus or the southern edge of the species range, so the hibernation period is a bit shorter than in areas more northern in their population or in their range. So we really do see them all the way into November. Never on these particular cameras, but there's even a handful of observations of them in December. What also stands out, just like the pronghorn, 2023 was a very big year for American black bears. Many more detections than we normally see. And I'll just mention for the folks at Coronado National Memorial that most of these detections, this increase in detections, was seen at the Coronado National on those cameras in the Huachuca Mountains. Very big increase in the number of bear detections in 23.
Eamon, just speak as loud as you can, please.
Okay, will do. One more thing that we can do with these cameras and these data is what we call sort of long-term monitoring of populations or detection rates, especially with these species that are a little more common. For species we have large sample size, we can actually look at some of those seasonal and annual dynamics in population and detection rates. So if we take, for example, coyotes and one of their more common prey species, so we can cluster or group lagomorphs in general, which is cottontails and jackrabbits. And we can plot those populations through time, where this figure is showing detection rates on the vertical axis. So that's basically the number of detections we see per day a camera is on the landscape, and plot that through time from the beginning of the study in 2020 through middle of 2024, for which we have processed data. Two things jump out. First, the lagomorph population, shown in orange, has a very pronounced kind of cyclical trend where they were decreasing in early 2020 through 2021, rebounding in 22 through 23, and perhaps decreasing again in 24. What we're seeing, it's subtle, but it is present, is that the coyote numbers really do follow the trends of the lagomorphs. They were decreasing again. They didn't rebound quite as quickly in 22, but there was that increase in 23, perhaps because of that population increase in lagomorphs. And we might be seeing that trend switching places again as time progresses in 24, but more to be seen there. Now, if we model this relationship, taking into account some things like habitat covariates, climate covariates, terrain, and just look at the impacts lagomorph numbers have on coyotes, we see a pretty strong pattern. This figure is showing the relationship between coyote detections on the vertical axis and lagomorph detections on the horizontal axis. Each line represents a different iteration of the model, and then that black solid line in the center is the average across a number of modeling efforts. What we see is a strong relationship between the number of lagomorphs and the number of coyotes. Another way to think of this is, as we have more lagomorphs on the landscape, we see more coyotes. Now, this is not groundbreaking. It's not a completely wild idea. It's a relatively known pattern where predator and prey dynamics mimic each other, and they're often cyclical. But it's validating to see that in our own data. It speaks to the power these data have to pick up trends like this, and also opens the avenue for further explorations of mechanisms driving these patterns. We really know that predator-prey dynamics do not happen in a vacuum. They are impacted by landscape and habitat covariates. And so we can actually think about what those impacts might be. For example, if we look at this figure, which is showing the same San Rafael Valley, on the left here we have the Patagonia Mountains, and on the right side we have the Huachuca Mountains. This is the Santa Cruz River coming down through the center. And these little blue points are our camera locations. What this image shows is the maximum vegetation condition during the monsoon season of 2020, excuse me, where the greener the part of the image, the more photosynthetically active, or the more healthy, the more green that vegetation was. 2020 was a pretty tough year. We remember low rains for the region. We still saw some amount of vegetation growth in the San Rafael Valley, but if we compare that to 2022, we see a very, very striking difference. 22 had a great year in 21, 22 was another year with good rains. We see this landscape was just much more vibrant, much healthier. What was unexpected and somewhat surprising for us up in Tucson was that 23 was actually a much harder year in terms of vegetation condition for the San Rafael Valley, where we see the same region compared to 2020, there was actually tougher drought conditions on some of this landscape in 23, despite additional rains in 22. Now, the work is still preliminary, and we need to dive into these patterns, but if we place the population trends we're seeing in these animals against this pattern in vegetation condition, we actually see some correlation, right? Where 2020 was a dry year, 22 was such an amazing year, species potentially rebounded, and after a tough year, vegetation condition-wise in 23, that population might be declining again. This is the same figure I showed earlier, but just as an example, we can look at the same relationship with other species. So here is a graph showing some mesocarnivores, in this case, gray foxes and skunks, collectively, all 4 species of skunks. Their population or their detection rates show a very similar pattern where decreasing perhaps in response to that drought in 2020, responding positively to the general vegetation conditions through 22, and perhaps decreasing again through 23. These data are interesting, again, ecologically very interesting to explore this, but it also has strong management implications as if we can understand the impacts large-scale climatic variables have on these populations, we can help us better plan and manage these species into the future. A final piece or final focus we can work on with these data is the impacts of human choices, the impacts of anthropogenic disturbances, like this shipping container wall that the state of Arizona decided to build in 2022 as an effort to force federal administration to do more with border security. The state decided to build a wall on their own, and they decided to do so with shipping containers. This was deemed illegal, and the shipping containers have been removed from the landscape, but the impacts remain. In fact, the Forest Service is just now working through some planning for restoration activities to improve or restore the habitat and the damage caused by this effort. Our cameras were present on the landscape throughout this whole process, and we actually can see or estimate the impacts this activity has on wildlife. For example, this graph is showing on the vertical axis just the average detection rate for medium to large mammals within the footprint of the shipping container construction. We see that there was a signature, detection rates were much lower while the shipping container wall was present on the landscape, and that it did respond positively once those shipping containers were removed. That pattern is much stronger if we isolate just the deer species. Predominantly whitetail, but we do have mule deer in this area. We see an extremely strong signature where before construction, the deer are occurring at a pretty high rate, but while those shipping containers were present on the landscape, they were effectively gone. They have since rebounded to largely pre-construction numbers post that construction activity, but this really highlights or shows the impacts of human disturbance, and in particular vehicle activity and wall construction activity on wildlife. This is just a case study, if you will, but it could be applied at a much broader scale. Now, speaking of roads and vehicles, we can return to a map of our study area where, again, those black dots are cameras, and the different colors on the border represent different types of border barriers. The blue throughout much of our study area is that vehicle barriers shown earlier, whereas the oranges and reds are pedestrian or steel bollard style construction, which we know is very impactful to wildlife. To highlight, our study is really in one of these open corridors that has relatively low border activity as far as construction and types of walls. But there are a ton of roads. That case study I showed earlier that shows the impacts of increased vehicle activity, increased border construction activity impacting wildlife, we know that's the case. This map showing roads are all the roads the Forest Service has deemed unnecessary and ready for retirement, so to speak. So we are working in a collaborative project with the Forest Service to retire these roads, to remove them from service so that the landscape is even more connected, if you will. It has fewer barriers to wildlife movement throughout this really important wildlife corridor. This is particularly important if we keep in mind that just last year, our cameras and several other cameras detected this magnificent creature, the jaguar, moving through the Huachuca Mountains all the way up into the whetstones. So this area is important for connectivity in general, but it's also really important for connectivity for charismatic species like this jaguar. and we do know that roads can impede connectivity. So our efforts to remove these roads and return them to more wild conditions will benefit species both common and endangered, like this endangered jaguar. And just as a quick overview of this project, we are all encouraging you to get involved. The next event is December 6th through 8th, but you're always welcome to reach out as we have ongoing events throughout all of next year. But of the 270 roads we've surveyed rather over 270 roads. Those surveys help us design restoration plans. We have now closed 5 of those roads, but more are being closed very soon. What that amounts to is 1.5 miles rewilded, and this photo series from left to right really shows the impact of this work, where we start on the left with the road in its original condition, we fence it off, we apply some debris, we plant some native seeds, and on the right, we see it slowly returning to a more native or natural state. If we look at just the amount of habitat we're benefiting from just this 1.5 miles alone, it's nearly 26 acres. That's a fantastic improvement for the habitat, and we would welcome all of your participation as we continue to build this project to complement our border wildlife study, where we're monitoring wildlife, monitoring connectivity. We're also working to improve the habitat for wildlife throughout the region. Now, again, this is a confluence, it's a mixing zone, like May and Emily said, where we have aspens and saguaros, we have black bears and jaguars coming together. And it's important that we study and we maintain the connectivity so that these species can continue to coexist. What we really are watching and working to prevent is that this area becomes completely impermeable to wildlife. And we are so grateful for all of your assistance, all of your help, all of your contributions, so that our work and our study can help keep this area open and understand the impacts we're having on these wonderful species. I will close. I apologize for the technological issues. I hope it was still understandable, but we're here. We're happy to take some questions and address whatever you need.
Thank you, Eamon. It's really wonderful to see the patterns that are showing up. And one of the first questions is going back to the seasonal patterns that you talked about, and whether it's possible that some of the increases that are showing up there are because those animals are not being able to cross border barriers in other places.
That's a really, really great question. So are the border barriers that are adjacent in our study area effectively funneling species into the San Rafael? We are still considering those data, and one thing that makes it challenging is there wasn't much assessment done before construction. So we don't necessarily know all that occurred before in those adjacent habitats, but I believe through time, and also as our adjacent studies that are taking place in San Pedro and the San Bernardino reach 2, 3, or even 4 years of data, we can actually evaluate how those populations of animals are changing in relationship to the population changes we're seeing in the San Rafael Valley. But that's a really astute question, and one we hope to dive into as time allows with more data.
Yeah, and can you just clarify specifically for the Huachuca Mountains? It's a little confusing where there is actual wall and where it's vehicle barrier. Can you clarify where our cameras are in relationship to those 2 types of barrier?
Yes, again, so the border barriers so if we start from the western side, so in the low part of the valley, and we head east, it's vehicle barriers all the way up to the western slopes of the Huachuca Mountains. And as we head up the passes, if we're going to Sierra Vista, we're transitioning from vehicle barrier to actually just a section which has nothing but barbed wire fencing. There's a tiny 300-yard long section of pedestrian wall at the very center of the pass that was built in 2020. And as you descend onto the eastern slopes of the Huachucas, so south of Palomina, so south of Hereford, you return to pedestrian barrier. In that case, it's a blend of the 18 and 30-foot wall. So the Huachucas are right on that transition zone, and they remain a very important open corridor, but the wall is encroaching very closely from the east up the eastern slopes of Huachucas that people or the pedestrian wall is starting to show up or has been there. So
Okay. Some other questions that came in while you were talking, and one of them is going back to those incredible images of the effect of the monsoon and the greenness with NDVI. And there was a question about whether we're looking at any correlations between what's happening with the wildlife community and specific plant species.
really great question on whether or not we are relating sort of specific details of the habitat with the wildlife detections we're seeing. And on this first pass, we have stayed at a very broad scale to look at sort of regional trends in either precipitation or in the general condition of wildlife. But I think to have more accurate predictions and more accurate results, we would need to incorporate specifics of the actual camera location. At the scale or at the resolution of the satellite imagery we're using for the vegetation conditions, we don't quite have the resolution to say, these are X types of grasses or this type of tree, but it would be an interesting avenue for further exploration. Certainly, if someone knows of a really precise and fine resolution map of vegetation, I would love to talk to you and incorporate that into any of our efforts.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's sort of the beauty of this. I think there's more and more we can layer onto this, collecting other data, collaborating with others, where we can bring in that kind of detail, because surely there are patterns that we haven't yet been able to decipher from this area. Another question was just about reptiles and are there studies specifically looking at reptiles in this area? And maybe you could just explain, Megan, put it in the chat, but for everyone's benefit, why our cameras aren't designed for reptile study.
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, we are in one of the hotspots for herpetology in North America with a lot of incredible species and diversity. The cameras present a couple challenges with reptiles. One, reptiles are small, they're usually close to the ground, so their detections are difficult. And also these cameras require a heat signature where, in addition to movement, the animal has to be at a different temperature than the ambient environment. And reptiles often mirror very closely the temperature of the landscape, temperature of the air. So they actually pass kind of like secret little ninjas in front of the cameras that don't always trigger them. So it's not necessarily a very reliable way to detect them. But it's partially that and partially that they're just smaller and at different scales of space use than what our cameras can pick up. But we do have some fun documentation of things like Gila monsters and coat whips, even a handful of photos of western diamondback, a lot of spiny lizards if they're moving close enough to the camera. But for us, our focus is medium and large mammals for a lot of these analyses, as they're what are designed to be picked up by these cameras.
So thanks, Eamon. Another question came in about the project you talked about at the end with the road decommissioning and restoration, this rewilding work, and what really are the benefits of it. I can jump in and talk a little bit about that, and then feel free to add. One of the primary things that we're trying to do is to increase the footprint of native vegetation. So the road prism, that's pretty extensive. The Sierra Vista district has over 700 miles of roads, and it's one of the highest density of roads in the country, I understand, on Forest Service property. So the decommissioning effort is really to try to convert bare ground into something that is productive vegetation. We want to see native plants, a lot of grasslands, some succulents, oak woodlands coming back there. Part of the reason is because that is the base of the food chain, so it supports the whole variety of animals that have been talked about this afternoon, or this morning, not afternoon yet. And it also helps stabilize the soil. So part of what our work is doing, and the reason why we're putting brush and compost basically down onto the roadbed, is we're trying to help soil redevelop to support those plants and also to prevent the soil that's there from bleeding away. We see a lot of erosion on these roads. The road system is so extensive, the forest is not able to maintain it, which means that they're constantly, when it rains, we start getting channelization, the soil's running away, and we're losing carbon as well. So what we can do is help to restore that soil. That's going to allow the rainfall to percolate in, help keep the San Rafael Valley greener. And then it has the benefit then of supporting plants and the animals that depend on those plants. So that's a big reason why we're doing that. And also very importantly, there are Native American cultural sites that have unplanned and unsanctioned access into those areas. And so by closing these roads, we can also help protect important cultural sites.
Yeah, thanks, Emily.
Yeah, I'm just, Eamon, another question that came in is just, you shared a lot about, you mentioned cattle and then you know so much about the animals, but how much are you seeing humans on the camera network?
Very great question, and one that comes up with the sort of larger scale or countrywide dialogue with the border being a place where folks are moving through. To put it in percentages, we have less than 0.25% of all of our photos of wildlife or things is a human, and that includes hunters and hikers and birders and people on UTVs. So the volume of people showing up on cameras is extremely, extremely low. I can't remember precisely, but it's something like 6 to 8 times more photos of gray foxes than of people in our study area. And that's kind of contrary to some of the stories we hear at the global or national level, but San Rafael Valley, pretty low volume for people, at least on our cameras.
Yeah, great, thank you. So you and Megan talked a little bit about what are charismatic species, which I think they're all charismatic. So that's very subjective, right? But we talked about some of the bigger species, and that's a focus for us often because we're trying to understand how barriers are affecting them. And the larger the animal, the more likely they're to be affected by these barriers. So that's a hypothesis that we're studying. But do you have any other insights into other species that maybe you didn't mention that you want to share? Some of the species that don't make it to the big size category, but have some interesting notable patterns?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and obviously don't mean to be picky or ignore important species because they're all valuable in the food chain or valuable for the landscapes. For today, we worked on things starting with the skunks and gray foxes as they represent the similar trophic zone of that mesocarnivore. We decided to work with lagomorphs collectively, being cottontails and 2 species of jackrabbits, because they represent sort of the base of the food chain in some ways. We've heard them described as sort of I don't know, the power bars of the valley, where there lots of things eat them, and when their numbers are doing well, there's food sources for a lot of larger predators. But for now, and for the points of the folks of today's talk, we did just focus with skunks, gray foxes, lagomorphs, and on up to the coyotes as a predator. I don't know if we have data prepared for other species. Megan, if you have thoughts based on your time reviewing all these photos, if there's been interesting trends or patterns with other things, but we're certainly always exploring data and planning to keep going further to look at additional species beyond what we presented on today.
I suppose they're also charismatic, but the mule deer and white-tailed deer interactions is always fascinating. The mule deer are less common on this landscape, but they are still there, and to see how they change over the year and over the seasons and interact with white-tailed deer is always.
Yeah. And these cameras show those patterns really strongly. If we think back to that map where we talked about sort of the distribution or the composition of the skunk community across the landscape, we can see a very similar pattern with the white-tailed mule deer, where in the mountains on either side, the east and the west, it's mostly white-tailed deer. As we transition down into that lower part of the San Rafael Valley, right near the Santa Cruz River, it's mule deer dominant. The mule deer are the dominant species, but as we increase in elevation, increase in tree cover and things like that, it switches again. So there's a very striking pattern where they are overlapping, they are co-occurring, but the composition and which is the dominant species changes as you transition through our study zone.
Okay. Yeah, there's a comment in chat about how these deer are actually interacting, and is it more shifting across the landscape, or are they friends or foes?
Megan, do you have?
I think you have to look at the data for that, but I have not seen any physical rivalry.
I think it's more of a competitive exclusion than like direct and antagonistic fights where a mule deer is, chasing a whitetail. I think it's more that mule deer are a little bit more adapted to the drought, the drier conditions. Whitetail deer are shown to prefer higher moisture, a little bit cooler temperatures. So it's more of a habitat niche thing than necessarily a direct fighting between species. But they do co-occur on cameras, and they'll be minutes apart sometimes. So they are capable of coexisting.
Well, something we haven't been able to analyze yet, but it's on our mind, is to look at the impact of the forest management that the Sierra Vista district is doing as part of the Huachuca Firescape. They have been doing a lot of thinning of brush and trees and doing the prescribed burning that Megan showed photos of. And so that's changing the cover clearly, and that changes habitat. And there are behavioral differences between mule deer and white-tailed deer, and who likes more cover, which is the white-tailed deer. So it's possible that some of that changes in vegetation cover could end up being a factor in some of the patterns that we're seeing, and that's something that we have planned to look at. Mac, thanks for your patience. He's been wondering if you could describe a little bit about the Santa Cruz River, which of course the headwaters in the San Rafael. It goes down, crosses the border, where so many of those pronghorn observations have been, and then it loops around through Sonora and comes back into Arizona further west. Can you say a little bit about the river where it comes back into Arizona?
Sure, absolutely. So just like Emily described, our the center of our study areas are the headwaters for this river that then comes down into Mexico and returns up through the western Tucson area. And our study focuses more on that headwater area, but we are expanding a little bit into that Santa Cruz corridor as it comes back up, say, a little bit west or east of Nogales and up through towards the Tucson Basin. And the diversity of species is quite high. I mean, it's a really popular corridor for things like turkeys and javelina and deer. There is a bit of cattle activity. Mac Hudson had a wonderful property where we have some cameras that we're observing some of the species as an initial exploration of this lower part of the corridor before it transitions up into the Tucson Basin. We're really grateful for that opportunity. And what we've learned so far is that the diversity of mammals is quite high, despite the heavy influence of more urbanization, much closer to this region than where we have in the headwaters or the core of our study area, where the core of our study area is. And so it's a very important corridor for wildlife, and we're excited to move forward with some more additional monitoring in the area through either collaborations or the potential to expand with additional cameras. But it's certainly a riparian corridor that's very important for wildlife.
Yeah, and importantly, the border context for the crossing of the river into Arizona, there's a stretch of vehicle barrier. So it's surrounded on either side. We're talking about the western crossing where the river is flowing back into Arizona. There's 18-foot border wall on either side of the river, but across the river is vehicle barrier, and then the border road has a slightly elevated bridge. So it still is passable based on our data to many of the larger bodied terrestrial species.
And
Okay, we just have a couple
very
minutes
important.
left, and we got a really interesting question, a direct chat to me. So I want to talk about this because sort of the interaction between the border and climate change.
Right.
Certainly when we think about animals on the move because of climate change, as a species, the ranges could be shifting, or individuals having to move in order to find the resources they need as the climate is changing. Do you think that our cameras would be effective at showing either species showing elevational changes in terms of their habitat ranges in the Sky Island, or what can you say about that and the value of these data?
That's a very great question, and one that is is a big one that we need to address because it's a reality we're facing as we go forward, as we're currently seeing changes in climate. And I think that's something that sets this border wildlife study or our work apart, is it is a fairly long-term study so far. I mean, it's 4.5 years, approaching 5 years, and we see a lot of importance in keeping the study going so that we actually have a continuous data set that looks at some of these changes that can take place at a slightly slower scale than just annually or seasonally. So I think we have some of these the amount of data, the richness of data to actually explore some of those changes. And if we are seeing elevational shifts, I mean, we see species occurring at different elevations. We're seeing that shift in the skunk population that's likely related to some of their habitat requirements and needs. And so that's an opportunity, right, to see as climate changes, does that community of skunk, the composition of the skunk species or population, does it change? And is it at all related to changes in the climate? So really wonderful question, and one that we see as important, and one of the reasons we prioritize keeping the cameras on the landscape, so that we have a long-term data set to evaluate those changes that can occur at slightly slower paces. But yes, wonderful question and really an important question.
Yeah, I agree. And this is just the study zone is sort of intermediate elevation in the Sky Islands, this, 6,000 feet. And it spans several different Sky Islands where we're doing this work. So it is sort of a band across where we could be seeing that kind of movement over time. Yeah, so as you can imagine, based on the number of photos that have been analyzed and all of the work here, this is a tremendous amount of effort. We really are indebted to the volunteers that are out there checking cameras, coming into the office, helping us process photos, our interns, and the many donors, as we said in the beginning. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up, but you are welcome to contact us if you want to talk more about the study, if you want to support as a volunteer, make a donation. This is a study that we'd love to keep going in the future. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all you do. We will post the recording, double checking the sound quality. We will re-record anything if we need to, and we'll make sure that's up on our website, and you're welcome to share it with friends and family. So thank you so much. I really appreciate seeing you all this morning, and have a great rest of your day.